Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, and welcome to another edition of Black Focus. I'm your host, Ron Edwards, coming to you on a very, very snowy day in April the 3rd, by the way, and visibility is bad, if you will. Wind is blowing, snow is coming down, and can you believe that on the morning of the 4th of April, tomorrow, that wind chill will be a little bit below zero? Makes you kind of wonder what's really going on with climate change. People are saying that Al Gore didn't know what he was talking about. You have a feeling as you watch this that he clearly knew what he was talking about. But anyways, hopefully in a couple weeks, things will begin to happen. The grass will show, flowers will begin to bloom. The squirrels and other little furry creatures will finally say, okay, maybe we hibernated too long, overslept, did something wrong, because this is not the way it's supposed to be. I was saying to the executive director here that I can remember as a very, 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 very young person, we used to see these kinds of winters in the 1950s. But I don't know. This has been a peculiar one, if you will. But it probably comes along every 35, 40 years, if you will. This is Minnesota. What can you do about it? Absolutely nothing, if you will. Library here from the personal library of yours truly, talking in terms of America during the period of 1929 to 1945. It talks in terms of freedom and fear, if you will. And this is a heck of a book. Found this in one of those little bookstores that has basically been run out of business by Amazon and all the rest of the biggies. Freedom from Fear, David M. Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy put together a book. This book is 936 pages, if you will. You probably have to go on Amazon, Facebook, or someone to find it. But I recommend. By the way, it's published by an outstanding publishing house, Oxford, if you will, so you know they're top of the line. Freedom from Fear, the period from 1929 to 1945. Many of you, in light of what's happening in the White House, and those that have concerns about their future, you may want to indulge a little bit more in publications and readings such as that, if you will. President still in the White House. Boy, this guy is having a heck of a time. He is an angry man. He is very, very angry. The only problem is when you have access to the kind of military hardware that he has, you have to be concerned. By the way, he announced a couple days ago, again, as we said, we're taping on a Tuesday, a very snowy Tuesday here in the Twin Cities. He indicated that he's going to be inviting his good buddy, Vladimir Putin, to the White House, if you will. I imagine then Vladimir will invite him to the Kremlin. Though I'm pretty sure the documentation will show that President Trump, before he became president, was a visitor to the Kremlin, if you will. That's probably some information that Robert Mueller is sitting on, and will shock some people. It will not shock journalists such as myself and others. But keep your eye on all of this, if you will. They are working on the meeting in May between the president and the dictator, as they call him, of North Korea, Jong-un, if you will. It'll be interesting to see what happens there. Conflict continues between the European Union and the Russians expelling people. You know this is a tit for tat. I mean, we watched it, the president jumps up and expels 60 Russian diplomats, if you will. But then he turns around and says, yeah, we're going to be getting out of Syria and leaving it to the Russians and their allies and et cetera. I really don't know. Oh, by the way, just since we were with you last week, President has fired a couple more individuals. He's got a couple he should fire, but they represent the kind of corruption that he's comfortable with, he being the president is comfortable with. And you just don't know where this is going to stop, when this is going to end, how it's going to come about. And how much more, particularly in a midterm election year, how much more so many Americans can fake their way through as it pertains that all of this is okay. I notice, though, the president doesn't talk about Miss Clifford, whose stage name is Stormy Daniels, who has really been putting all the president's business out there. The president's wife has got to be livid, but she's a smart woman. Wait until he is no longer in a position of power, and then divorce him and get half of his wealth, which she will clearly get, no doubt about it, particularly in that there will be, the son will be, 13 years old, 12 years old by the time the president's first and only term as president of these United States will be up, if you will. Interesting saga. That's really what it is. It's a saga. It'll be interesting to see if this republic is still being held together 40, 50 years from now, how authors, some of whom have not even been born yet, will write the history, will interpret, if you will. They may try to do like Sinclair Corporation, one of the largest American media companies now, being given a lot of free passes, if you will, who are actually ordering their anchors to read false news, fake news, and et cetera. And, where do you go? It's refreshing that here at MTN, this entity, this media entity, is trying to give you the right news, honest news, clear and concise news, which, is becoming a little bit rarer and rarer in the United States of America. By the way, tomorrow, 4th day of April, it will be on tomorrow, 50 years ago, that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated on a balcony at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, if you will. I can well remember where I was and the things that I thought, if you will, about what I was really feeling. And a lot of African Americans across America showed that as American cities erupted, if you will. There were casualties here in Minneapolis and St. Paul. In fact, a young Caucasian with a 5-month-old child and a wife was walking down Humboldt Avenue North, right there at the 1100 block on Humboldt. Young Caucasian was not responsible for anything that had led to the assassination of King, except the generation and the generating of anger. Another gentleman, an African American, who we grew up with, know them, and had known them, et cetera, walked out of his home there on the 1100 block of Humboldt. He was crying. And he said, as he saw this young Caucasian father walking down the street on his way to the small grocery store there on Plymouth, that they killed my king. They killed my king. My king is dead. And then he regrettably, for all times, shot and killed this young father, if you will, and then waited there for the police. There were other acts of violence that took place in the Twin Cities that afternoon and that evening and the next afternoon and the next evening and et cetera. The National Guard, federal troops, everybody was called out, if you will. We were a nation that was on the abyss. We were close to a total rupture, if you will. If it had not been for ecumenical and spiritual leaders of all colors and persuasions, and the discipline of the African American or Negro community, as we were referred to in those days, not wanting to be about butchering and killing and maiming and et cetera, we probably would have imploded, exploded, and disappeared, quote unquote, as a democracy. This was a country, for those of you that research and know your history, where the United States was engaged in a war that it was not winning, never did win it, just like they did not win the war in North Korea or the Korean Peninsula It was called Vietnam, if you will. It was to continue for another 4 years, if you will, before the United States departed, got out, made all kinds of excuses. But a lot of young American lives of every color, description, gender, were left to die in the paddies, in the rice fields, and the mountains of Vietnam, if you will, formerly known prior to 1960 as Indochina, if you will. And so I will reflect private thoughts tomorrow as I listen to folks talking in terms of Martin Luther King Jr. I saw a piece earlier today, again, we're taping on a Tuesday, a piece on MSNBC, because it was Craig Melvin, interviewed a lady who was 21 years old, was a waitress and a cook at the Lorraine Motel, which was a very classy establishment, if you will. In the days of segregation, there in Memphis and other places in the South, it was segregated here too. We'll talk about that one of these days, about it was difficult if you were an African American or Negro, as we were referred to get a room in a downtown hotel. It wasn't until a man by the name Bob Short, who had bought the then Minneapolis Lakers, soon to move very quickly to Los Angeles and become the Los Angeles Lakers, who actually broke the covenant, which said that black people, Negroes, if you will, the sons and daughters of the African, could not stay in hotels, top of the line, if you will, in downtown Minneapolis. And we think about that, as many of us were thinking about the death of Martin Luther King Jr., but there were others that had been killed before Martin Luther King Jr., male and female members of the black community, in some cases, white citizens who supported and worked and marched with African Americans. Viola LaRusso, as an example, the wife of a union leader in Detroit, Michigan, shot to death on a highway in Alabama because of her support, if you will, for Negroes, for African Americans, and etc. There were many that lost their lives doing this struggle over a very long period of time. And so I'm not sure how our young people, our so-called millennials, will honor, if you will respect the 50th anniversary of the death of Martin Luther King Jr. in Memphis, Tennessee. But I know what those of my generation felt during the hours and the days and even the weeks following the assassination of that great American, if you will. And so long as I am able to speak to it, speak about it, speak on it, and have a platform as we have here at MTN, I will continue to do that. Because it was a moment of testing for this country. As I said earlier, this was a country that could have imploded. There could have been tremendous violence and deaths. The armed forces would have had to have been put into play militarily. The armed forces would have disintegrated because black troops fighting and carrying the principles of democracy in Vietnam and other places throughout the world would have stopped fighting, and in many cases would have turned on their fellow soldiers and etc. We as a nation don't like to talk about that, and our historians really stay away from it. The features in this book, by the way, were written before the Vietnam or the Korean conflict. As we said, this book deals with the period 1929 to 1945. But even during that period, there were occasions when the fiber of democracies and its institutions began to become unraveled, if you will. And if not for the leadership of individuals, be it such as Franklin Delano Roosevelt, his very lovely and insightful and visionary wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, and others, If it had not been for quote unquote black leaders of that particular day, if you will, we may not have made it even out of that particular period. And so we say that because tonight we are going to take a look at deception, if you will, cover up, if you will, and the fact that we have never really had the kind of discussion that we needed to have had as we move into the final 41 minutes of tonight's program on the deaths of African Americans in the Twin Cities at the hands of law enforcement authorities and quote unquote others who are considered to be militia and et cetera. We don't, well, they don't. We have talked about it for many years, even long before this program, which is now in its 27th year, if you will. But this evening, early evening, as of the taping of this program, we want to talk about a young man whose name we brought up purposely in the last couple of weeks because we became aware that, to our own surprise, we were a little negative because we thought that the case had been dropped or that some small settlement had been made and an agreement had been made to swear everyone to confidentiality and etc. It is Terrence Terrell Franklin, T.T. Franklin, as we oftentimes say. You see there on the screen the occasion and the date of his death in a basement in South Minneapolis on May 10th, 2013. Again, that date, May 10th, 2013. I can well remember when the call went out that there was a chase going on. Also that day, people tend to forget that about 40 minutes after Terrence Franklin's head was blown off, that a young Hispanic gentleman on his motorcycle going down Blaisdell, if you will, was hit by a Minneapolis squad car going at a high rate of speed. This was 35 to 40 minutes after Terrence Franklin had been killed in that basement at that house in South Minneapolis. We became very familiar within a very short period of time, like hours. We're not talking about days, months, years, and etc. And so as we enunciated last week, when we received a call a couple of weeks ago from the attorney representing the family and the estate of Terrence Franklin, and that is his father, Walter Franklin, we felt it incumbent to ultimately share with you, our viewing audience, and in the tradition of MTN, whose responsibility and job it is to make sure that we do receive the news and information and et cetera, and not get caught like so many are getting caught in this country with so much emphasis on what's happening with Donald Trump, if you will, that we've lost sight of news that is happening every place across the world and in our country, be it Sacramento, California, or be it the trade wars, if you will, or be it impending strife, or be it the war that is going on in Black Africa that no one is talking about, where Black Africans are being killed by American military forces that we first talked about here 3 months ago after the death of a young 26-year-old African-American Special Forces sergeant, if you will, Sergeant Johnson of the United States Army. So much information being kept from you as it pertains to how this country is ticking. Click, 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 if you know what I mean. But Terrence Franklin's life was ended in a basement, if you will. Documentation that has now been filed with the federal courts, if you will, and a document that has been prepared by the attorneys for Terrence Franklin to be argued before the Supreme Court of the United States of America if the court so decides to hear the case. Now, the reason that it's really important to the city and the taxpayers of the city of Minneapolis is because if the federal court, the United States Supreme Court, declines to hear the case, and as we said 2 weeks ago, that would be kind of a reversal of what people of color and African Americans basically can look forward to as it pertains to the history, because normally we are quote unquote the petitioners and we are quote unquote left out, and the case is not heard or is sent back for review, rejudication, and etc. But if the United States Supreme Court does not hear the case of Franklin versus the city of Minneapolis and the named officers, chief, mayor, etc., this case will have to go to trial. And initially, this case was to have gone to trial on the 10th day of November 2016. All dates are important, but the reason that this date was interesting because that was 2 days after what? 2 days after the election, the upset, as they said, of Donald Trump to become 45th President of the United States of America. Donald Trump, billionaire, according to him, though he doesn't file income tax. You try to get away with that, you're going to jail. A friend of Vladimir Putin, if you will, and also friend of many quote-unquote young women, if you will. We, in the next couple programs, because it really isn't that important, it's not as important as the situation that we're talking about with Terrence Franklin. We're going to bring our copy, quote-unquote, of the manifesto, if you will. It talks in terms of not then President Donald Trump's activities, sexually and otherwise, in Moscow, in the presidential suite at that time, with any number of women, and receiving a golden shower. There are many of you out there that know what a golden shower is. That is the Pacific incident that they really don't want to give any kind of latitude or confirmation to, calling it illicit and et cetera, and et cetera, and et cetera. And so in some regards, the story of Terrence Franklin meets that particular caption. Corruption, defamation of character, cover-up, and a case that now the city is going to try to meet and discuss a settlement, if you will, even though the city, starting after the decision on November 10th of 2016 by Judge Donovan Frank of the United States District Court for the Federal District of Minnesota, Donovan Frank. We gave you warning of this particular story, which is extremely egregious, if you will, to justice, law and order, even an opportunity of fairness. But on November 10th of 2016, just 2 days after the presidential victory by the very good friend of Vladimir Putin, man who may be the true leader of America, if you will. Only time will tell. And the only thing you've got between you, quote unquote, and real oppression is Robert Mueller, the special counsel, if you will. But an incident had taken place on the date of, and this was also ironic, on the date of May 10th, 2013. In other words, we're coming up on 5 years. In 5 years, as the family, loved ones, and the attorneys for the deceased have been waiting for their opportunity to examine the facts. Now let me tell you who have examined the facts and made determinations. Judge Donovan Frank reviewed the matter as he was getting ready to become the trial judge, if you will, when the city of Minneapolis filed motions demanding, asking, but really demanding for a summary judgment. And part of it was around the issue of immunity, if you will. For those of you that will take the time and find it important enough to understand why there is so much anger and frustration within the African American community, you may want to do that. It's on file, but you have to know how to access it, if you will, because they are actually public documents, but they have been almost held captive by the system, except for the court. So first, Judge Donovan Frank reviewed the motions and everything that was brought forward. He ruled in favor of the city on some things that were lightweight. But on those most important issues that went to the death and the circumstances surrounding the death of Terrence Franklin, Judge Frank, Donovan Frank, want to make sure I keep saying that name so that folks, don't play like they have amnesia, didn't hear it, we've said it 5 times already. Donovan Frank said that this case must go to trial, that his review of the documentation and etc. prepared for the law firm of Michael Patton and later to be incorporated into the appeals, if you will, had to go forward. That the Franklin family and their attorneys had proved the necessary points of law, the necessary contentions, if you will, under color of law, that this case must be heard, either at a bench trial or by a jury. That was the ruling of Donovan Frank. Lo and behold, no sooner than he had handed down that ruling on December 7th, 2016, the city of Minneapolis appealed to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, which sits in both St. Louis and sits here in the city of St. Paul, the 8th Circuit. The 8th Circuit took the matter under immediate advisement, if you will, reflected on it in their sessions, if you will, and the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals gave a hearing to the motions made by the city of Minneapolis indicating that this case had no standing, that the Franklin family had no standing, and that the facts and conclusions presented by Michael Patton and his law firm had no standings and had no facts, if you will. Well, now a 3-member, that's the way the system works, a 3-member panel of 3 judges of the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, there are 9 judges on that court, coming from Minnesota, the Dakotas, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, and Missouri. The 8th Circuit 3-member panel on a 2-to-1 vote supported the determination by federal judge Donovan Frank and indicated in a 2-to-1 decision that this case must go forward and must be heard and justice must be served. Immediately, the city of Minneapolis and its leadership filed motions to ask an appeal to the full 8th Circuit Court, that the entire court hear the matter. This is done. In fact, one of the appellate divisions here in the United States that gets this a lot, because the conservatives really don't like them, they just had a death on that court about 4 days ago, is the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which is out there on the West Coast, California, Nevada, Oregon, Washington, and etc. Interesting enough, the full Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, none of this, by the way, has been reported to you by the newspapers here in your beloved Shangri-La, the state of Minnesota. The full court did something rather interesting, stunned the city of Minneapolis, stunned the city attorney, Susan Siegel, and the law firms that they work with and who make tremendous amounts of money as private law firms, if you will, working with the taxpayer-paid city attorneys, were shocked when the entire Eighth Circuit, this is the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals, said it is not necessary for us to review the decision of the three-member panel or of Judge Donovan Frank, and that this case will not be reviewed and is now sent back to the trial judge. Didn't send it back to the three-member court, if you will. It sent it all the way back to the trial judge, which meant that his rulings had been upheld and that the case must now go to trial. We were now coming up on better than 4.5 years. Lo and behold, the city of Minneapolis, without any kind of publicity, if you will, as we said, the major newspapers here in the state of Minnesota have written nothing about this. We know that they are working on some stories because of the broadcasts that are being carried here on MTN, and of course that makes enemies for MTN in many different quarters. People do not like people who believe in freedom of speech, if you will, and the right of the public to know. But the city of Minneapolis gave notice of intent. You must do these proper things, these protocols, if you will, because the federal court system, contrary to what Donald Trump and others are trying to do to the arenas of justice and jurisprudence and etc., the courts are very pacific, if you will, and they are very absolute, is the word that I would use under color of Anglo-Saxon law. They are absolute with regards to how matters of law and justice will be treated. I repeat that again, how matters of law and justice will be treated, if you will. So there was another shock for the city of Minneapolis, because in that the victim was an African American and the officials, if you will, particularly the police officers, were Caucasian, white. The sense was that maybe the race card could be played. Well, unfortunately, Judge Donovan Frank didn't play the race card. The three-member panel of the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals on a 2-to-1 vote didn't play the race card. The full 9 members of the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals said they weren't playing the race card, and now the officials of government here in the city of Minneapolis are holding their breath because the appropriate papers have been filed, motions have been filed. The law firm in Washington, D.C., which works with law firms from around the country in matters of appeal and etc., because actually only about 1/10 of cases that are appealed to the United States Supreme Court are heard starting on the first Monday of October. And so when it became known to the attorneys for the Franklin family that the city was appealing this, was asking the Supreme Court of the United States of America, if you will, so that y'all don't, get confused. This is not the state Supreme Court. This is the United States Supreme Court. This matter, by the way, was quietly moved into the federal court. That was never really reported by anyone. And I have not heard any of the leaders in my civil rights community, in the African American community, even talk about this case anymore. And as we said, on May 10th, in a couple of weeks, this case will be 5 years old as it pertains to being brought forward. Going back quickly, one would ask the question, what was the role of the county attorney? You know the county attorney. He's been on the lips of everyone, if you will. We've talked about him here in studio at MTN. Mike Freeman, the well-versed, knowledgeable, I will never use the grand jury again, to I'm going to use the grand jury, though I'll make the decision. That same Mike Freeman. Well, see, Mike Freeman was the county attorney when this matter was reviewed in 2013. Let me suggest this to those of you out there who are saying, what is this black man talking about? I don't remember this case, and etc. Go back, take a look at our website, the Minneapolis Story. Many of you do look at the website, and take a look at my columns in the Minnesota Spokesman Recorder for a 2-week period in May and the following 2-week period in June. Because also in those 4 columns, we gave you, our reading audience, and we also did the same thing in these studios. At that time, we were at St. Anthony, Maine. And we talked of at least half of the numbers of young African American men and women who had been killed by police here in Minneapolis, and there were a couple of others around the metropolitan area. Yes, we go back. We have posted that, by the way. Those 4 columns, those 4 articles on our website, as we said before, which is and then the full word, MinneapolisStory.com. As we said, many of you know where to find it. We will, in the next couple of programs, put on display hard copy of those 4 columns. Those columns spelled out what had really happened that tragic day, May 10th, not to be confused with November 10th, 3 years later, on May 10th, 2013. As Terrence Franklin was beaten, torn apart by a police dog named Nash, who, by the way, could not come into the house until the owner was able to retrieve his kitten. The owner would not give permission. He had a little cat in the house, and they were not going to let Nash come into the house, kill the cat, and help kill, quote unquote, Terrence Franklin, if you will. Now we're going to spend the next 20 minutes talking about some of the things that basically you, the public, the good citizens of Minneapolis and St. Paul and the state of Minnesota, and by virtue across the nation, because tomorrow night, Wednesday, we will be talking across the world on our worldwide blog radio program that airs here from the Twin Cities. And the phone lines will be open, and we will be asked some specific questions, and we will give some specific answers. But back to the 10th day of May, the last minutes, if you will, the life of Terrence Terrell Franklin, T.T. Franklin, if you will. For those of you that still remember, don't you remember we were going to have a big march for him? People gathered down at the government center, if you will, probably 3,000 to 4,000 people marched. And what happened was the march for Terrence Franklin got hijacked. In fact, it was so sad that a couple days after Terrence had been killed, which was before even the hijacking of the Terrence Franklin tragedy, his sister had attempted to call for a rally in front of City Hall. And for those of you that remember, her attempt was undermined. It was undermined by a combination of law enforcement, and it was undermined by certain members of the so-called civil rights community, of the African American community. It's like so many of the killings that we talk about in the 4 articles that we wrote for the Spokesman Recorder in May, late May and early June of 2013. We talked about the honor roll of young African Americans, male and female, that had been killed by the police. We couldn't even get to those that were killed in circumstances in which they were just found in the middle of the street with a bullet in their head, and the ruling would be cold case and quote unquote gang related, if you will, with people not understanding what is really happening in this city with regard to the death squads, et cetera, that had been in play here for a long, long time. When I was in junior high school, man, we used to talk in terms of the death squads that worked the streets of our city in those situations where African Americans, or Negroes as we were called, showed up dead. At least the Native Americans had a fairly decent understanding, because their young men were being taken down under the old Plymouth Avenue Bridge and thrown into the Mississippi River to either drown or be shot, if you will. And for those that will jump up now and say that's outrageous that MTN will allow that kind of conversation and et cetera, I would call your attention to testimony given, my God, 20 years ago, before a federal grand jury sitting in the old federal building there in downtown Minneapolis, in which a young lady, last name Johnson, not going to tell the whole name because she would be in danger, but I will tell you this on this particular case, and the information she gave to an FBI agent by the name of Barmucci, who had to take early retirement after grand jury testimony by, yours truly, who had to testify before a federal grand jury in a particular matter. But in the case of Miss Johnson being interviewed by a special agent, this all ties into what we're talking about, going all the way back to the early part of this program about T.T. Franklin. But Miss Johnson gave a statement to FBI agent Barmucci, which was suppressed. And she told about how she had been in a relationship with a white police officer. See, this is not supposed to be told, my friends. And because we're also live streaming it, and et cetera, there are some of you that are getting this really firsthand, that she was told by a white officer on how they execute and assassinate people of color, Native Americans, and et cetera. And in the course, he told her about how they took Native Americans down under the bridge, the old Plymouth Avenue Bridge, and threw them in the water, threw them in the Mississippi River, and et cetera, and they drowned. They died, if you will. If they were able to survive, no one would believe their story, if you will. She told that in an interrogation room at the old FBI headquarters in the old federal building in downtown. The report was never sent to the FBI. It took me calling a woman by the name of Linda K. Davis, who was the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights at that time, working through a very good friend of mine who now is deceased, Jesse Taylor, who was head of the Department of Justice's Community Relations Office in Chicago, Illinois, worked this entire region. Jesse was one hell of a guy. He was a man that loved and respected his job, and he loved and respected the law, just as Linda K. Davis did. All of this is in the files and in the testimony before the federal grand jury, if you will, Assistant U.S. Attorney Lynn Zander actually tried to have me jailed as a part of certain testimony that came forward and et cetera, but the federal judge did not allow that to happen, and I continued my testimony for an entire day. Oh, there are stories to be heard in this town as we move back towards Terrence Franklin and his brutal execution, if you will. When the kitty was taken out of the house and the house was secured as pertains to that, a Minneapolis police sergeant and his dog, his faithful dog, Nash, went down the stairs. And according to the documents and etc. now on file, and written in my columns in 2013, if you will, Terrence Franklin was found hiding behind a hot water heater. The dog was sent in on him, if you will, delivering bites to his shoulders, his neck, his testicles, as we've talked about, and etc. He was then drug out, if you will. His dreadlock was pulled out of his head, if you will. He was beaten, and this is in the documentation. He was beaten with a flashlight, and he was punched in the face, and etc., as the other members of the SWAT team were moving down the stairs into a killing position, if you will. At some point, the police officers actually said in their depositions, oh, I got to tell you, for those of you that are really interested, if you will, for those of you that, quote unquote, betrayed the pursuit of justice, I know you don't want to read this, but in the depositions, it was interesting, the testimony, but what happened, and we must say it here clearly and distinctly, that Mike Patton and his associates was able to turn one of those 5 officers who were a part of that SWAT team. And they went on to tell the real story of how Terrence Franklin, with his hands in the air, was shot. Forensic confirms that. Again, I refer you to the depositions, and I refer you now to the documents filed by the Patton Law Firm with the United States Supreme Court. You know, we're not talking about some stuff, conversation going on between a bunch of black guys standing around on the corner. This is serious business. It's tragic. It's also dangerous as it pertains to how a system works. Terrence Franklin, who allegedly had his hands in the air like this, if you will, according to one of those officers, was shot by Officer Peterson right up under the armpit, right here. It then caused him to go into semi-unconsciousness, but what you were never told, as the reading community of the big, powerful Minneapolis Star-Tribune or even the St. Paul Press or any other news media except what we have written and discussed for over 5 years, he was taken into a small laundry room. I can well remember, as my sources were making me aware of what really happened, I couldn't quite understand initially why Mr. Franklin was taken into a little small laundry room and the door was closed, and then a second series of shots were heard. That's when, while laying on his left side, he was shot. And see, they never told you really how many times Terrence Franklin was shot by these 2 officers. A third officer attempted to put himself in the room, but there was a specific reason, and we will be getting to that pretty quickly. It had to do with a law enforcement agent from another jurisdiction who also was in that basement. Star-Tribune, the reporters for the Star-Tribune never told you this, but we'll take that in its sequential. And so Terrence Franklin was drug into that little laundry room there. The door was closed. You wonder why the door was closed, because that shut off access for the number of other people that were on the step trying to get into the house, trying to get in. And I hate to use this word, but it is necessary because it is in the court documents and it's been confirmed in depositions and etc. As one of the officers, I know who he is, I will wait at some other point, cried out, "We're going to get you, little nigger." Yes. That's what this white officer said just before They drug him into the laundry room, closed the door, and shot him an additional 9 times. 9 times they shot Terrence Franklin, if you will. They blew the whole right side of his face off, if you will. They shot him in other places in his body. The dog had already, Nash, the big police dog, weighed 79 pounds in the documents now filed with the United States Supreme Court, in which now the city of Minneapolis sometime on the 12th or the 14th is going to try to make some kind of offer to the Franklin family. They cannot afford to have this case come to trial, if you will. And so the life, though he, being Mr. Franklin, probably was dying after being shot right up under his armpit while his hands were in the air. He was saying, his nickname was Mookie, by the way. He was saying, yeah, I'm Mookie, I'm Mookie. That's what led to him being called that little, N-I-G, if you will. He was blown apart. In fact, the owner of the house, Mr. Bickle, again, read my articles 5 years ago. We even gave you the address. He was in such a state of shock that when he ultimately was allowed to go into the laundry room, he just could not understand all of the blood. I mean, there was blood all over the wall and etc. But a couple of things happened. There was a Department of Corrections officer, and man, this person became crucial to help the cover-up. For those of you that remember the case or may go back and take a look at it, the police and the medical examiner and the forensic laboratory maintained that Terrence Franklin, the deceased's DNA, was on the front part of the barrel of the MP5 submachine gun, if you will, which is a close contact weapon. And I remember, and I wrote about it in my columns in 2013, particularly the columns, the last column in May and the 2 in June. So it's not a question that, this black man is sitting here making all of this up. Now, this is an American tragedy, if you will, my friends. And D.O.C. David, if you will, his name, and we'll be talking about it tomorrow night on our worldwide program. There will be questions asked of us about this individual, but D.O.C. David of the Department of Corrections is the person. We had always wondered who it was that transferred T.T. Franklin's DNA to the barrel of the gun. And one of the officers who gave depositions and testimony came clean. And the city has known for a long time that happened. The courts, the judiciary system, the same system that refused to throw this case out and say there will at least not be an opportunity for justice and fairness to be applied. The Supreme Court of the United States is now looking at that, and certainly the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals. And God bless Judge Donovan Frank, because as he read the depositions, the testimonies, the arguments, and the conclusions that were laid before him as the person that was to have been the trial judge, he realized that a crime had been perpetrated beyond anything that Mr. Franklin could have done. Mr. Franklin's gone now. His father has continued to fight the battle for 5 years, if you will. There's been silence in our community. We talked earlier today on this program about how the Terrence Franklin rally was hijacked by the so-called organizers of that beautiful march, talking in terms of a young African-American killed by a vigilante in Florida. I know that all y'all remember that, but Mr. Franklin deserved his day, though deceased. His family deserved his day to call attention to a brutal execution, my friend. And as we finish the last 3 minutes of tonight's program, because there are other things that we are going to hold in advance until our worldwide program tomorrow night as an example, but we will be in a position here at MTN to continue to bring you up to speed about this brutal situation. And maybe we will get the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, who wrote a horrible story, which we talked about in edition 3 of our columns in June of 2013. The Star-Tribune. In fact, a couple days after the death of Mr. Franklin, the Star-Tribune had the audacity, take a look at the names of the two reporters, to write that Terrence Franklin had shot and wounded 2 police officers, if you will. My friends, for those of you that are interested and feel that it is important to make time to review the documentation now being prepared and already handed to the United States Supreme Court. We're not talking about handed to some black folks, etc., and Amos and Andy and all of that. We're talking about to the 9 members of the Supreme Court of the United States. In closing, maybe, in the next year or thereabouts, unless there is a settlement next week, that the spirit of Terrence Ralph Franklin will finally be soothed, be relieved, and be provided with justice for the brutal murder of that young African American in that basement in South Minneapolis. Failure to do so though, will mean a continuance of those names that were in my column in the May and June editions of the Minneapolis/Minnesota Spokesman Recorder. And all we can do as the black community is shake our heads, shrug our shoulders, though this commentator has no intention of ever allowing that to happen. And we'll just say, well, let us move on, if you will. Next week, I'm going to talk about some of those that I identified in my column in 2013 and tell you, including the death of a young African-American disc jockey for radio station KMOJ, who was shot and killed by a police officer that he had filed charges against in a case that was about to go to trial before that young man was shot and killed in the middle of the street in North Minneapolis. Well, my friends, never let it be said that the African-American community has not been tenacious in asking questions about the importance of justice. God bless you, Black Minnesota. You need the hand of God upon your shoulders. On behalf of our very fine production staff, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening.